Thank you again. Thank you for being here to join our conversation about religious freedom under Obamacare. Splendid first panel. Very pleased to welcome you back for our second panel. I'm going to call to the podium Elizabeth Argue. Elizabeth is a frequent participant in our constitutional studies program. She's one of our fellows this year, and she'll introduce our panelists.
Good morning. Michael Zuckert is the Nancy R. Drew Professor of Political Science here at Notre Dame. He attended Cornell University as an undergrad and continued on to the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD. He arrived at Notre Dame in 1998, and he works in political theory and constitutional studies, in both of which he has published extensively. He was awarded the 2011 Jack Miller Center Chairman's Lifetime Achievement Award for his academic excellence. Father Michael Heinz is a priest with the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, and rector of St. Matthew Cathedral in South Bend. Ordained in 1993, he received his PhD in 2008 in Latin and Greek patristics from the University of Notre Dame. He teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in theology and is the director of the Masters of Divinity program in the theology department. K.J. Martin Kramers joined the University of Notre Dame as professor of finance in 2012. Prior to that, he was a faculty at Yale School of Management from 2002 to 2012, after obtaining his PhD in finance from the Stern School of Business at New York University. Hailing from the Netherlands, his undergraduate degree in econometrics is from the VU University Amsterdam from 1993 to 1997. So without further ado, I will pass the microphone over to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our broad topic, as I understand it, is can or should for-profits claim conscientious objector status? This panel, as opposed to the earlier one this morning, is to address the ethical rather than the legal aspects of this issue. I'd like to begin then by stating something that I think is implicit in the question as formulated. That is, if we are asking about conscientious objector status and exemption from this law, we are beginning with the assumption that the law is otherwise valid and that the only issue about it, for our purposes anyway, relates to conscientious objections that some might have to it. So taking for granted that the law is otherwise valid, except for conscientious objections, I want to specify further that the ethical issue here actually has two parts. First, does the for-profit business owner who has conscientious objections have an obligation not to comply with the mandate? Second, does a for-profit business owner with conscientious objections have a right not to comply with the mandate? Now, this second is obviously a different but obviously related question or issue to the first one, but it differs in one very significant way. If the business owner has such a right, it would follow that the government would not have a right to punish or penalize him for not complying with the mandate. This is obviously a stronger claim than the first, so I'm going to begin with it. Now, the most obvious way to treat this question of a right not to comply is as a question of free exercise of religion. There is a clear constitutional right to free exercise and also a very widely recognized moral right to free exercise. So the question is the mandate a violation of free exercise? Now, the classic instance of free exercise is religious worship and religious speech themselves. So the moral right to freedom of religion would prevent the government from regulating such things as whether one should kneel or stand or sit during worship, whether one should use one or another holy scripture, or celebrate the Mass or not, affirm the Trinity or not. It is clear this mandate is not a direct regulation of religious exercise in this very direct sense. But there are many actions that have religious significance that may also be in the sphere of actions government might have, or at least claim, some power to regulate. So laws often prescribe or forbid actions that religion may also prescribe or forbid. Classic instances are the second table of the Ten Commandments. Judeo-Christian religions recognize religious duties not to kill, for example, and the secular law forbids the same. But there are also potential conflicts between actions prescribed or forbidden by religion and actions prescribed or forbidden by the state. So, as an example, China, well known, has a one-child policy and in effect requires the use of contraception or, in the case of excess pregnancy, abortion. Since use of contraception and abortion are contrary to the religious duties of Catholics, among others, such laws as these Chinese laws would be a violation of religious freedom, and there would be a strong moral case for conscientious objection with respect to these laws. But this mandate in the Obamacare law is not like the Chinese laws. It does not require anybody at all, much less individuals with conscientious scruples, to use contraception. The mandate does require such conscientiously scrupulous individuals to support activities indirectly that they have conscientious objections to. Should this be a strong enough ground on which to claim a right not to comply with the mandate? Comparing it with conscientious objector status in the classic case of military service, I think helps to bring out the issue well. The conscientious objector in the military case is not involved in this indirect way with the action that he has a conscientious objection to. His or her involvement is rather quite direct. That is, he would be required to serve in the military, which has the possibility of taking life. Now, I can think of no instance where a moral right of this indirect sort is generally recognized, and many counterexamples come quickly to mind. Pacifists are allowed conscientious objector status, at least some of them, but they are not exempted from paying taxes that support the Defense Department. Christian Scientists have conscientious scruples about using medical services, which is generally recognized as their right, but they are not exempted from taxes that support Medicare and Medicaid. Indeed, it seems it would open an immense can of worms to recognize a right of this indirect sort. So this does not seem to be a right claim that is viable. Indeed, the generally accepted rule is that if a law has a valid public purpose, claims of conscientious objection do not stand against it. Now, we'll take a very extreme instance, a religion that practices child sacrifice or genital cutting or any of those sorts of things. We certainly wouldn't, I think, claim that they deserve a religious conscientious objection from the prohibitions against those activities. But we also recognize in the law and morals a looser and broader category, a little weaker perhaps, not a general right to ignore public policy that one disagrees with on conscientious grounds, not a right as such, but a rule that the government should accommodate conscientious objection when it can do so without jeopardizing the public policy it is pursuing. I have a note here I cannot read. The contours in legal and moral thinking of this accommodation practice are not well defined. But a good example of how to think about this is contained in the case where the Supreme Court carved out a doctrine of accommodation for the first time. In this case, the state denied unemployment benefits to a female Seventh-day Adventist who, for reasons of conscience, would not accept work offered to her for Saturday work, that was her Sabbath. The state, in effect, denied her something available to similarly situated others on account of her religious scruples. This was held to be a violation of her religious liberty and might be treated as a model for our case of the mandate. Should the state treat the mandate in this fashion as a moral matter? I do not believe so. To allow an exemption to the mandate to all employees who claim all employers, I should say, who claim a religious objection, is in this case to deny to third parties, their employees, a right that all other similarly situated persons who do not work for religiously scrupled employers possess. This introduces a serious issue of inequity and unfairness for these two classes of employees and threatens to undermine the aim of the law to provide health coverage to women. This is quite a different situation from Mrs. Sherbert, the Seventh-day Adventist. To exempt her from the requirement that one be willing to accept available jobs in order to qualify for unemployment benefits did not harm others or deny their rights. It may well be morally and legally appropriate to carve out a conscience exemption for her, given the ramifications, or rather lack thereof, of doing so. The mandate case does not seem parallel. But let us say that the case for accommodation is stronger than I believe it to be. Let us compare it again to the case of conscientious objection to military service. Normally, the objector is required to perform some alternative service that does not raise the same questions of conscience as does military or combat service itself. Shouldn't there be an equivalent here? Isn't an equivalent even more necessary here? Because we are asking about for-profit businesses. And it is important to distinguish a company's desire to opt out in order to save money from genuine conscientious concerns. But it is not evident just how to provide an alternative service in this case. Perhaps such conscientious objecting businesses could be required to offer what has come to be called Cadillac health plans above and beyond what would be the normal, that would cost them comparable amounts as the plans with contraception coverage. Right. I want to turn now to the second part, briefer, which is with regard to is there a conscientious duty not to comply with the mandate? I'd like to begin by making another distinction between conscientious duties and general moral duties. A conscientious duty is a duty of which the agent involved, I believe, must consciously recognize as such a duty. And I think there's a connection here between conscience as such and consciousness as such. It's captured for those of you who have studied French, you know that the French confuse these two things and makes difficulties for us, so they use the same word for both. A normal moral duty may be possessed by anyone, a normal moral duty may be possessed by somebody who does not recognize it as a moral duty. That is, it can be a duty that one possesses, whether one is conscious of it or not, and I'm arguing that conscientious duties are ones that one is conscious of and claims. Therefore, a conscientious duty is only held by, at most, by persons who themselves recognize such duties or can be brought to through instruction or argument. So that leads me to my first conclusion on this point, that business owners in general do not have a conscientious duty to be conscientious objectors on the mandate. At most, only those who feel or recognize such a duty do. Now, what goes into a conscientious duty? I think we can distinguish conscientious from normal moral duties in terms of the grounds on which one recognizes the duty and the basis on which, or the source of content for the duty. It is widely understood, I believe, that duties of conscience are not derived solely from a kind of reasoning that is universally applicable to all human persons. Some of the most important conscientious duties derive from faith and faith traditions. It is thus very difficult, if not impossible, for one outside the faith tradition involved to judge what the faith tradition requires. But it is, of course, obvious that in a pluralistic society with different faith traditions, the claims of conscience cannot just hold sway, for then everyone would have a right to carve out an exemption for themselves from the laws, and social order would be impossible. Indeed, while I feel personally unable to legislate conscientious objections for others, I believe that all faith traditions, including the Catholic, see public order and the common good brought about by public order to be a good that all are indeed conscientiously bound to uphold. So while there may be, and I'm not saying that there is, a conscientious objection not to conform to the HHS mandate, there is an equally clear, or perhaps clearer, conscientious obligation to social order and the rule of law. It follows that the two duties of conscience need to be pursued in tandem, so that the pursuit of the duty, if there is such, to resist the HHS mandate is done in such a way as not to threaten or undermine social order, rule of law, and otherwise valid public policies. We do have a recognized way in which these things can all be done together, and that is called civil disobedience, where the agent violates the law to which he or she has objections of conscience, but accepts the penalty for doing so. This is the outer boundary, I believe, of a duty to conscientious objector status in the HHS mandate debate. So, two very short conclusions. First, with regard to the right of conscience, I have argued that there is no such right, nor was there even a loose obligation by government to exempt all Catholic employers from compliance. Secondly, with regard to the duty of conscience, I'm unable to legislate conscientious duties for anyone. But I do believe that widely held understandings would lead to the conclusion that if someone concluded that they had such a duty, that duty exists in the mode of civil disobedience, that is, of willingly accepting the penalty for noncompliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Even a cursory reading of Democracy in America reveals that Tocqueville viewed religion as an essential element in the life of a vibrant and healthy democratic republic. He rightly saw the health of society as intimately related to its religious faith and practice. Now, I am not by training an ethicist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. I'm actually an academic theologian, but also, perhaps more importantly, a pastor. And I see the vexing questions which are before us today as right at the heart of the intersection between moral theology and pastoral theology. Now, the tag pastoral has unfortunately all too often been understood to mean a kind of casuistry in which moral principles are somehow relaxed or loosened or rationalized away in particular concrete and difficult cases. Pastoral in its deepest sense, however, means the care of souls. The sole craft of nurturing and guiding folks who, in good faith, desire to do what is right, even in the most muddled of circumstances and in seemingly intractable situations, when obvious or clear answers seem at best remote or at worst impossible. Pastoral theology rests on the foundation of a solid theological anthropology, a proper understanding of what it means to be authentically human, and a rich moral theology. And its aim is to assist believers in assimilating the gospel in its fullness. Pastoral care involves helping individuals to form their conscience in accord with the truth, and then assisting them as they navigate through the choppy and dark waters of messy and sometimes unforeseen circumstances to act in accord with that rightly formed conscience. Whatever social benefits are to be derived from the HHS mandate, as it has come to be called, and however noble its stated aims, it nevertheless places Catholics and others, and I cannot and do not pretend to speak for others, in a very difficult spot. Catholic insurers and Catholic business owners who provide health insurance benefits and derivatively, Catholic employees who pay into group insurance plans are expected to comply with elements of the Affordable Care Act which can and do demonstrably violate their moral conscience. The lengthy tradition of Catholic moral reflection provides us with a conceptual language to assist in this navigation. First, it has always emphasized the supremacy of the rightly formed conscience, a judgment of reason which, in communion with the truth as revealed by God, ascertains the moral quality of a particular act. And second, it employs the distinction and relation between what is called formal and material cooperation, and to each the qualifiers remote and proximate, both of which admit of varying degrees. The recent and so-called accommodations released by the Department of Health and Human Services in response to the serious concerns voiced by the U.S. Bishops' Conference alter in no significant way the force or implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and in fact have earned the public criticism of a number of bishops, notably Cardinal Timothy Dolan, president of the Bishops' Conference. And further, for our purposes, they do nothing to offer relief or exemption to Catholic for-profit business owners who are the subject of today's colloquy. The witness of Catholics in public life has always been, in some historical moments more obviously than in others, eschatological. What one theologian has called Christianity's intrinsically eschatological humanism means that there will be numerous ways in which believers quite simply do not fit, so to speak. Living now, as if it were then, they are to become a living sign, a sacrament of the age to come, Christ's kingdom, as it were, breaking forth into the here and now in a very concrete way. These are the saints, canonized and uncanonized. And not infrequently, even in unintended ways, this sign, this martyria, will be perceived more as a gadfly, an annoying presence and voice in an age whose gods are often reducible to the immediate, the expedient, and the efficient, and in whose coarsening and utilitarian moral calculus a desired end can quite easily and happily justify almost any means.
Thank you. Thanks, Philip, and the organizers and supporters of this event. So I'm a professor of finance, and not a theologian or a philosopher or a political scientist or a lawyer. And so I want to talk about business. So I speak more as a lay Catholic who tries to speak from my personal understanding of the Catholic social teachings, what that would imply for business owners. So what is it, in my understanding of the Catholic teaching, hopefully by the grace of God, I'm doing justice to that. What would a Catholic business owner aspire to? And so then before I'm going to answer your two questions, Philip, I want to first do three other things. First, I want to talk very practically about what I think is at stake. Second, I want to talk about business. What is the purpose of business? What are the priorities of business? And given those, how do you practice business? And then I want to combine the first, what's at stake, with the purpose, practice, and the purpose, priorities, and practice of business. And that will allow us, I hope, at least to some extent, to give us a sense of what the cost and benefit is that we are talking about. And with that, we can then go to the two questions. Now, what is at stake? So, with all respect to Professor Zuckert, and I would very respectfully argue that you didn't address the actual ethical issue at stake at all. I would also want to argue that it's not at all about imposing the views of the Catholic business owner on somebody else. That's also, do not think that is also what is at stake. What is at stake, in my mind, is that a Catholic business owner should not want to hurt others. So it's very simple, I think. If your moral conscience tells you that some things are moral evils, that means that if you use them, you're going to get hurt. Then this is, I think, a very direct ethical implication. You shouldn't hurt others. So as a Catholic business owner, you shouldn't want to facilitate something that you believe is going to hurt others. So now what follows, I'm going to drop the you think or you believe, or I'm going to drop the facilitate. I'm just going to make it very simple and say, you don't want to hurt others. Right? And every time I say that, you can add by yourself that you believe that, you think that, or you are facilitating that in a somewhat direct or indirect way. By the way, I apologize, I have a very bad cold, so I have to get my water. Thank you. So that's what I think is at stake. The government is forcing you to hurt others. So what is the purpose of business? In my mind, in my understanding of the Catholic social teachings, the purpose of business is to create value. To create value for everyone by fulfilling genuine human needs, to contribute to human flourishing, to contribute to the common good, that start with respect for individual and equal fundamental human dignity. And here value, I mean very broadly, anything that fulfills genuine human needs, including, of course, financial wealth, but really everyone involved with the company should be better off in a fundamental way by interacting with the company. Right? So creating wealth for everyone. Given that, what is the priority of the company? Well, that would be to be fair or just to everyone involved with the company. And that means to be, as a business owner, in the right relationship with everyone that is involved with the company. The right relationship to your employees, of course, but also your right relationship to investors, treating them fairly and justly, to the community that you're involved in, of course, very importantly, to your customers, to your suppliers, everyone involved with the company. Right? And that's be in the right relationship, having a sense of solidarity with everyone. Given that, well, how do we practice business? Well, if the priority should be to be in a just relationship with everyone, then the practice means, well, we have to be just. And that means that in business, the practice of business means it's that the practice of business becomes growing in virtue. Many virtues, entrepreneurial virtues, right? Courage in taking business risks, discipline in focusing only on what you're good at, or learning to grow better at what you have to learn and growing better at. Prudence, right? Sound judgment, to know, what risks to take and what not, and how to apply all the other virtues. And of course, maybe most importantly here, justice. Now, if you are forced to hurt others, what does that mean as a business owner, for your practice of virtue, for your priorities to being in a right relationship with others, and for your purpose to create value for everyone? Now, I would submit that a law forcing you as a business owner to, in your mind again, by facilitating the hurting of others, is bad for all of those three. So it's just bad business. It's bad business to hurt others. It's first and foremost bad for others. It's also bad for you, and it's bad for your relationship with God. Now, justice, you can distinguish general justice, commutative justice, and distributive justice. I don't have time to go into that, but I think all of these, see rapidly, you can make a case that hurting others is directly bad for those three. So kind of unjust in all three aspects. It's also bad for your relationship with your employees. If your employees understand that you have a moral conscientious objection to providing this to them, and they still partake of it, but I cannot see that as being anything but really bad for your relationship with your employees. Would you accept the gift if that gift is forced by the gift giver? Right? If the gift giver really doesn't want to give you this, but he's forced to do that, would you accept that gift? Right? And I think that's another ethical issue that I think is really important to talk about. And then the purpose of business is to create value, right? To do good to others. Well, clearly, if you're hurting others, you're not doing that. So the should question, I can't really answer for anyone, but I would also say, though, that what we should do is have well-informed consciences. As Catholics, that means that we try to conform our own conscience with the teachings of Holy Mother Church. And we kind of submit, to the best of our abilities, our conscience to our church, recognizing that we have very limited capacity ourselves to understand. And so we need the guidance of our mother, the church. Well, yes, surely we could. But how, I think, is a very difficult matter. So I'm going to give you just some of my thoughts here, very well recognizing that I'm not a Catholic business owner here. Right? So it's very easy for me to say what one could do. So the first thing that we could do is to pray, is to make sure that our consciences are indeed well formed. The second thing we can do, other than the things I talked about, right? Treating everyone right, trying to create value, being in a right relationship with others. In that spirit, being in a right relationship with the employees, I think it's important for a Catholic business owner to communicate with your employees. Try to explain your genuine concern for them. To reach out to them, to explain, and then as part of that, you can actually even ask them that if you decide that that's the most prudent way to go about it, that even though you object to being forced to do this, that you can say, well, I'm going to force to do this because I'm choosing a greater over a lesser good, and then I can let the theologians and ethicists decide whether or not that's okay in this case. But that's what I'm going to do, but I'm asking you not to use it. Okay? Yes, I'm going to comply with the mandate, but I'm going to ask you to not use it. And I think that if you have the right relationship currently with your employees, and they understand that you're acting from a genuine concern about them, okay? And that means you have been generous with them in the past, and you are generous with them now, and you will continue to be generous with them in the future. They know that you're acting out of a genuine concern for them, that they, on my mind, will almost surely agree with your request, even right, if they do not agree with it. And then the third, well, do what businesses do, be creative. Think about other ways to get around difficult moral issues. Thank you.
The idea behind this panel was to have a discussion, and to help us with that discussion, let's get 3 of the smartest people on our faculty from different disciplines and put them all together. And so thank you very much. Absolutely thrilled with the range of views and what's been said, and I'm thrilled that we have lots of time for questions. So again, any students want to start us off? Okay, any questions? Sir, if you could stand and identify yourself.
I'm a 1947 graduate of Notre Dame. I took a course in social justice while at the university, and it said that every human being has the right to adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and adequate education. The Affordable Care Act is an act that says that it's trying to cover more and more Americans with some kind of adequate health care. They talk about 31 million more. The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, for over almost 100 years, have said that's what we want. We want everybody to have adequate health care. But let's look specifically at Notre Dame and the Affordable Care Act. First of all, at Notre Dame, what percentage of the people at Notre Dame are non-Catholic? That would be other Christians, other faiths, atheists. Maybe 20, 30, 40%? Now the law says that all women, this is part of federal law, it's passed, the Supreme Court said it's okay. That means here at Notre Dame, if you ask to have this mandate taken away from here, now remember, Catholic grade schools, high schools, and parishes are exempt from that, but not public universities and hospitals, mainly because there's a large number of non-Catholics. Now, it says all women. Now, if the university asks to have this mandate taken away, what they're saying to me is, our conscience says that this is not right to give you this. Even though the non-Catholics, some of them, or many of them, might feel that in their own conscience, for a good reason, to take a contraceptive or to have a sterilization surgery is important for their health and health. You know, maybe they believe that that's right. It's not intrinsically evil as the Catholic Church does. Now, I think the crucial issue here is Notre Dame's conscience, and I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a retired priest, is the Roman Catholic conscience about birth control and sterilization, is that more truthful than the conscience of the non-Catholic people that are here at Notre Dame, Protestants, atheists, and other faiths? And besides that, I don't think the bishops have really read the Constitution on Religious Freedom. In the first paragraph, it says that every human being, because of their dignity, have the right to their own private conscience. And no person, no individual, no group can coerce you to take away your conscience. I feel that what Notre Dame would be saying if the mandate were taken up, it's saying to the non-Catholic people, employees, they're saying, our conscience trumps your conscience. That's pre-Vatican II thinking. If you go back to the time of the concordats between Rome, the Vatican, and Italy and Spain, Protestants could not practice their religion. They couldn't openly worship there. Why? Because the church had a concordat. We have the truth, and the Protestants, don't accept our truth, and therefore they have no right to their freedom. We don't have to worry about that.
Okay, let's see if our panelists have.
But I just want to say, the crucial question, does the Catholic conscience here at Notre Dame trump the non-Catholic conscience? you know, and say that we're better than they are. Would we be taking away their freedom of conscience as the Constitution on religious freedom says?
And in the dimension of an employer and employee relationship, anyone want to?
First of all, I think your point about the idea of sort of global universal coverage as a desired end is certainly, I don't dispute that. I don't think the bishops dispute that as a goal. That would be a wonderful thing because people are not, there are a lot of people aren't covered and there are all kinds of problems for all of that. That being said, that doesn't mean that because the goal of this legislation is universal coverage, that every aspect of the legislation is therefore good or noble or agreeable. In terms of your example about Notre Dame, it seems to me that there are certainly a number of non-Catholics, maybe non-believers, who are employed by the university, who may find the Catholic Church's beliefs about contraception bunk. And I mean, as far as I know, the employers aren't sitting them down saying, I need to know whether you think this is bunk or not. But the bottom line is, those opposing this legislation and those who are raising questions about civil disobedience or conscientious objection are not suggesting that, we're not saying that the opposition is not that someone who's not a Catholic and employed here might go out and get contraception somewhere. No one's stopping them from doing that. What they're saying is, we don't want to pay for it, and we don't want to support it formally by having it as part of the structure of our insurance plan. That's different from saying, I mean, Notre Dame could, I suppose, say we're forbidding all our employees from obtaining contraception. How they'd police it is a different question. I have no idea. But all they're saying in opposition to this is, wait a minute, we don't want to, if you want contraception, you pay for it. That's different from saying we're forbidding you from getting contraception. Now, obviously, I'm not a believer in contraception. I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. But nothing in the opposition to the Affordable Care Act on the part of Catholic institutions, I can't speak for the university, I mean, I'm employed here, but I'm not part of its legal structure, I'm not a lawyer. The argument, it seems to me, from a moral perspective is not that the university is trying to mandate what its employees do or don't do. What it's saying is this is what we're going to pay for and fund for our employees, and these elements don't violate our conscience, we'll support that, we can't support the other.
The other two panels?
I would say a few things. One, I think this gentleman's comment underlines a point that I tried to make, which is that there are third-party rights and concerns and interests involved here. It's not just a matter of a Catholic institution dealing with other Catholics, and that some of those parties, third parties, don't share this conscientious convictions of at least some Catholics. As I understand it, there are quite a few Catholics who actually do use contraception, but that's at least what I've read. I think the issue of being able to pick and choose what parts of public policies you're going to help pay for on the basis of your conscience is a very difficult, problematic position to take. I gave the example, for example, of pacifists who are required to pay their taxes even though they help support the defense budget, or Christian scientists who are forced to pay taxes that support Medicaid. It doesn't seem to me a viable policy. If we try to universalize or think in a more general term of the principle my colleague has just identified, I don't see how you could make that a general principle of policy.
I agree you have to draw a line somewhere. But for many business owners, I would think this is very personal. You have a personal relationship with your employees. You don't want to hurt them, right? And so yes, you want to be generous, and I can very well imagine a Catholic business owner, part of being generous means to be generous in giving your employees access to healthcare, right? That's very much a big part, I think, of what a lot of Catholic business owners want to do. That's why it is actually a difficult issue in the first place. Otherwise, you just drop your insurance, right? And you give it to the government to take care of, and actually you're cheaper off, right? The whole point we have in this debate in the first place is that you actually want to be generous to your employees. You want to give them very generous health insurance, but the government is forcing you to add on to that something that you think is going to hurt your employees. Right? I think that, in my mind, is the issue. The Catholic business owner, at least if their consciences are, in my mind, in conformity with the teachings of the Church, believes that these things will hurt the ones that use them. And in that case, I would say you want to try to avoid hurting others.
I don't want to complicate the issue. I'll take the Hobby Lobby case. In some ways, the biggest case out there, at least from public's perception, and case at the center of the thinking behind this panel. The owners of Hobby Lobby, again, as I understand it, don't object to contraception, but they're most concerned about the abortifacients, which was left out of that discussion. I mean, that clearly, I know there's some disagreement about that, but that would clearly complicate this issue even more. I see Professor Deneen.
Related to this issue of third parties, it seems to me that Professor Zucker pointed to the one plausible conclusion that could be drawn or action that could be taken from civil disobedience, and he pointed to the example of those who accept the consequences. But it seems to me complicating it in the same way that you have third parties who may or may not agree with the Catholic view of contraception, abortations, etc., is the impact of civil disobedience on third parties. So even where civil disobedience isn't undertaken, this gentleman pointed out that the best option may be to comply by pushing all of his employees off of his current healthcare plan. But I think Professor Kramer rightly brings out that this may be, in fact, in some fundamental sense, a violation of Catholic belief of what one ought to provide one's employees. In the case of non-compliant, engaging in civil disobedience, one could pay the fine, which may not damage the bottom line, but may damage the bottom line. Here you may be in violation of your relationship to your stockholders or other third parties. You could not pay the fine. I don't know what the result of that would be, but presumably some kind of garnishing, which you probably end up paying it anyway, plus additional fines. Last night, this kind of informal discussion after Mr. Byrne's lecture, it was suggested that if the case goes against Hobby Lobby, the owner of Hobby Lobby may simply decide that we will no longer be in business. That would have a pretty significant impact on their employees. So it seems to me that civil disobedience may, in fact, in all of its respects, or even compliance in all of its respects, go fundamentally. In every decision that can be made, go fundamentally against one's Catholic belief. So I actually raised the question of whether civil disobedience with these third parties, these additional people in the equation, is actually a really viable option.
I guess this is addressed to me, so I'll at least respond. Well, okay, I'll start anyway. I didn't mean to recommend that such a conscientiously objecting owner should engage in civil disobedience. For me, the issue of, I'm not a Catholic, as probably you may have guessed already. I don't feel capable of deciding what the conscience of a Catholic requires him or her to do. That seems to me to be something within the Catholic faith tradition that Catholics have to work out within the church and perhaps individually. And I did try to introduce some of the kinds of considerations, Patrick, that you mentioned. You gave more than I mentioned. But I was concerned, for example, about what I do understand to be part of Catholic teaching, that there is an obligation to the law and to civil order and the common good that those things produce. And I think the concerns you mentioned are also in the equation. For any given Catholic business owner, how at the end of the day he or she adds that all up and comes to a conclusion about what his or her conscientious obligations are, I mean, I just don't feel in a position to say. The most I thought I could say was, if this owner comes to the conclusion that the conscientious claims here not to comply are stronger than all the other, at the very least, or at the very most, it would amount to a right to civil disobedience and not a right to, I mean, I'm not sure what the alternative would be exactly, if the state is actually serious about enforcing this mandate. So I meant that as a statement of what I thought would be an outer boundary of what a conscientious objector to this mandate might do.
Tiernan, please.
My question is to Professor Zucker also. It seems that, well, first of all, that you can never achieve a positive moral duty by violating a negative moral duty, right? So the answer to whether you can fulfill your conscientious positive duty to provide health care simply fails as soon as you violate the negative duty against harming another person. That's kind of the preface, but the important point is, does the government not have an obligation to, insofar as is possible, not create a situation in which citizens are damaging their character, right? So if they're acting against a negative moral obligation, even if they're wrong in the judgment that it's wrong, they're acting against what they understand to be true. That would seem to create a civic problem. You're having citizens who believe that they should act against what they consider to be right. It would seem the government, insofar as possible, should avoid damaging citizens because it will hurt the civic body politic. Now you're creating citizens who think that they should act wrongly. Now, it wouldn't be an absolute right, but within the circumstances, these circumstances laid out by the professors on the last panel, where you could achieve these goals in other ways, wouldn't circumstances create a certain kind of necessity or obligation on the part of the government to avoid this harm to citizens, which will in turn come back and harm the rest of the citizens, the civic body?
The question is, insofar as I understand it, is does the government have some sort of affirmative obligation to attempt to minimize the lack of integration individuals might feel in complying with their perceived duties on the one hand and the law on the other?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, I missed most of the earlier discussion, so I'm sure they had many things to say from which I would have benefited in my presentation and in my answer to you, but not having heard them. It seemed to me anyway, you're in effect asking, is there an obligation for the government to work out a system of accommodation on this policy? That's, I take it, what your position amounts to. Is that fair as a restatement? In other words, we know there are people who object to doing this, and we should find another way to do what we're trying to do that allows them not to have to do this. Okay. I have, in the immediate case, I raised the problem, and this still seems to me as an important problem, which is of third-party rights and interests that are involved. That this would, if certain people are allowed exemptions from this mandate, then their employees who are not conscientiously bound in the same way are disadvantaged and treated unequally from people who are in other kinds of, who work for other kinds of employers. That's one. Second, I find it a difficult rule to apply across the board that says, well, we have to find ways in which we never actually trample or trench upon somebody's conscientious objections to something. This is just very difficult to do in a large, diverse society. And if this is set as a requirement of policymaking, our policies would be even more of a mess than they are now. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, and again, I would again answer is that we're talking about something very specific here. You have to draw a line somewhere, but it doesn't mean that we cannot accommodate in this case. And then we have to take each case as they come. To answer your question, I would say the government has a very strong incentive to accommodate, because the government should be concerned about the moral character of its citizens. If you think about business, then if you've been reading the newspapers over the last 10 years, you see one business scandal after another. There's a very clear incentive for the government to make sure that business owners consult their conscience and their character, and to contribute to the common good. And so if you, what the mandate effectively is telling Catholic business owners is to completely separate their moral views, their character, their conscience from their Monday to Friday practice of business. And so once you do that, well, the corporate responsibility, what will it come down to once you start completely divorcing that, right? Will it come down to, well, just make as much money as you can, and if you screw some people along the way, well, right? We asked you to leave your conscience behind, didn't we?
If if I may just briefly respond to my learned colleague and respectfully just raise a question about his concern about inequalities arising if some people would be covered and others wouldn't. Is the goal then, I don't think it is, some kind of radical equality among all employers everywhere where everyone makes the same amount of money, has exactly the same benefits package and the same insurance? People can work in different places. And if they're not happy working at Notre Dame because Notre Dame won't cover this, I mean, it isn't a system of inequality. I agree with you. There are other universities, State U, for example, where they might get all kinds of coverage for this. They're welcome to go work there. I mean, there are inequalities, but I also think those aren't imposed unjustly. Some places may not offer the same kind of retirement package that another place offers, and they might feel, well, that's inequitable. Well, it is, but there are solutions to that that are short of mandating a policy change, I guess.
Yeah, but I think it would be quite a different matter if the government said some places will offer this kind of retirement package that's really attractive, and other places will offer less attractive retirement packages as a government mandate. I think that's quite a different matter from what happens, in a market situation such as we have.
No, I don't disagree with you. I think the more fundamental question is, why is the government mandating this at all?
Okay, please.
In May from Notre Dame. And in discussing the duty of business to prevent the harm, perhaps, that is contraception in the idea, or in the thought of the business owner, is there also a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, to provide alternatives to women who may need to space births or prevent pregnancy for even a short period of time? Is there an ethical responsibility to provide alternatives such as coverage of NAPA technology or NFP? Because there are, increasing advances in this type of medical technology that's often not covered by insurance. And so it seems to me that one place where Catholic business owners could step to the forefront of these issues is by providing an alternative and saying, you know what, contraception and some of these pharmaceutical drugs, there are a lot of options here.
Martin, does this anticipate sort of some of the creativity that you were calling for at the end of the
Yes, exactly. Yes, I mean, it would depend on the individual business owner. But yes, they can be entrepreneurial and creative about it. It will very much depend on their circumstances. In general, I think it's good for business to be generous to the employees. And part of the generosity can very well be to accommodate the religious beliefs of your employees, very broadly, right? Whether or not your employees are Jewish or Christian or any other faith. And so, in general, I think as a business owner, it's very good to respect those differences and to accommodate them where you can.
Teresa?
First, just a really minor, I'm Teresa Smart, a third year in political theory here. A really minor clarification about an earlier point where Professor Zuckert kind of compared this to requesting pacifists to pay taxes in support of the Defense Department. I know that there have been many people who have made distinctions between taxation and the kind of payment that's asking here. I mean, Monsignor Hines used the terms material and formal cooperation, and taxes are typically classified as material cooperation and far more remote than this like very close relationship between the business owner and the employee. But my question is actually for Monsignor Hines. I thought that your talk went together with Professor Zuckert's in a really interesting way, and I was wondering if you could relate what you said about Christians qua eschatological signs and gadflies the side of the polity to Professor Zuckert's comments on civil disobedience. Do you think that paying the penalty for civil disobedience would constitute a kind of martyrdom? And would you pastorally advise a business owner who came to you to disobey?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think the relationship, I appreciated his distinction because the question posed was about the conscientious objector status. Whether or not you think that's a good thing, it may never be available as recourse in our current, in other words, the government may never say this is a possibility. As a result of that, civil disobedience is the only other seeming recourse available to someone who has serious conscientious objection. They won't be recognized by the state, but they'll pay a penalty or be punished in some way. Part of my I didn't say this explicitly because I was worried about economy of time, this business of eschatological sign, the Christians the vocation of Christians in the world is not to be a gadfly in the sense that they get up in the morning like, whom can I annoy now? Now, there are perhaps some who do that. On the other hand, it's to be witnesses to the truth, and that itself will be a gadfly. Now, I also believe that any republic is much stronger when people who have their convictions live them fully and don't separate out the public and private. I should bring my full wealth of faith and conviction to every decision I make, fully aware that there may be some secular humanist colleague of mine who brings the full force and weight of his or her convictions, and because they're not believers and I am, it's not as though they're value-free and I'm not. The mistake often people of faith make is to assume that, well, in a pluralistic society, somehow this has to be checked at the door, my faith, whereas my colleague, Joe or Jane, secular humanist, they don't have to check anything at the door because they're already quote-unquote value-free, which is, of course, ridiculous. That's freighted with all kinds of values and convictions that they're bringing with them, but I've already capitulated to them and assuming that they're somehow more neutral than I am. Neither of us is neutral. We should bring the full force of that. That actually helps a community and a society when I am living out most fully. That it's precisely when I check them at the door that it creates problems. In terms of the issue of cooperation, I purchased Starbucks coffee this morning, A, because I like it, but B, also for the point of illustration. I like Starbucks coffee. I don't like everything Starbucks stands for or supports. I'm aware that when I go in and buy my petroleum blend, I like it strong, that when I buy that there's probably some percentage of my $5.36 for medium coffee that is going to some cause that I don't like. That's remote material cooperation. I'm aware of that. I certainly formally don't buy into their convictions on every issue. That's a little different from walking in and seeing right next to the cash register and the Lumineer CD a jar that says, let's redefine marriage, and I start throwing change in there, both formally and materially cooperating with what they might want to do politically or socially. And so there are differences. I think we have to recognize those variations of degree. I pay taxes. I'm actually a diocesan priest, so we pay taxes. I'm not tax exempt. I'm quite certain that there are probably elements of my taxes that go to things I do not believe in or support, but it's remote and it's material. It's certainly not formal cooperation with those evils. So that's I think the importance, I think his distinction between conscientious objection and civil disobedience is important because that may be the only one we're going to see. And I would say that in the end, Catholic business owner, she or he has to decide, this is where I stand and I'll take the consequences. A number of bishops had said, I'll go to jail if we have to. We're not going to comply. The bishop of this diocese said publicly, I'm not complying. We're not going to comply. We'll go to jail if that's what it takes. And, I think that's a perfectly legitimate response. And it is a kind of witness, but it's not a witness done simply to garner attention. That's my fear, is that to use the language of martyrdom, in a culture that loves victimization, martyrdom and victimhood is not quite the same thing, at least in modern sense of victimhood. And I do think that witness is important, but the goal of witness is actually not the witness. The witness is given by living the truth, rather than seeking to be a witness.
Professor Garnett?
Two factors that I should have talked about more this morning that are really important when you're trying to think about the balancing that's always involved in a combination of religion. You mentioned burdens on third parties, and you mentioned the possibility of a competitive advantage being given to an accepted employer. So, for what it's worth, not that he needs my affirmation, Professor Zuckert is right that when we are trying to decide whether or not a particular claimant is entitled to an exemption under RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, two of the things we would consider would be, would an accommodation impose burdens on third parties? And it was a premise of my presentation this morning that other means would be found to provide coverage to anyone who would deny the their name, or at least decide to respond to the burden concern. And then the second factor, which again is very right to mention, is if we thought that a private business was securing a competitive advantage in the market by virtue of an accommodation, that would probably weigh against them getting the accommodation. My understanding is that most economists actually think that an exemption from the concept of coverage might actually end up costing lawyers more money. That remains to be seen. That's just by virtue of clarification and jumping on board. I wanted to hear from you, Monsignor, though, if you had any thoughts with respect to earlier questions, invocation of
I don't see a disjunction, with all due respect to Father Ritz, between the pre-Vatican Council, Second Vatican, and post-Vatican Council views. There's obviously development in doctrine. I don't deny that for a moment. But I do think that there's nothing, in opposition to concerns about the Affordable Care Act, to me, do not violate the religious conscience of anyone else. It's about protecting the consciences of those who, because of their convictions, don't want to participate and support formally and materially activities which are deemed harmful and wrong. Again, the distinction I used earlier, I don't think that, having said that, again, there are 8,000 employees at Notre Dame, I didn't know that. It's quite possible, and in fact probable, that there are a number of them who use contraception. I think that's probably fair to say. In a certain sense, even if this were to go in place and the exemption were granted, that's probably not going to change. They're already working for a university whose healthcare coverage doesn't support that. And so they're obviously purchasing it some other way or somehow. In a certain sense, that's not going to change for them. All that's going to happen is that if the exemption were given for the university, so they wouldn't have to comply in that regard, the people who are using it are going to continue, I suppose. I don't think anyone's going to be put at a disadvantage because of that. And I don't see that as a violation of their conscience. Again, they choose to work here. And again, I'm not trying to force people out of jobs. I know a number of people who work here who aren't Catholic, and I love them. We have a great relationship. It's not a matter of like, I want to force non-Catholics out and get the Catholics in. It's not at all. Let's be honest, some of the non-Catholics are more pleasant than some of the Catholics. So, that's not at all the issue. I don't think it's a question of violating their consciences. So I just don't see the disjunction. There are two ways of reading, of course, the relationship between pre-conciliar and post-conciliar Catholicism. One is the narrative of discontinuity, which certainly has its advocates. The other is a narrative of continuity, and I see it much more as, now obviously were there radical changes wrought by the council? Absolutely. But fundamentally, the depths of continuity are far greater than the discontinuities or changes that occurred.
Carter, the figure 8,000, is that just because it's easy to multiply? Okay.
Shoot.
Wikipedia will tell us.
Yeah.
One brief thing I just wanted to append to Professor Darman's comment is that Professor Zucker, talked about the unmanageability, the unwieldiness of a system in which we have to ask, is this state action going to offend this person? Is it going to encroach upon the religious interests of this individual? They might be idiosyncratic. The interesting thing is that that's precisely what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act did in 1992. It created a presumption that the federal government may not substantially burden your religious liberty unless, and there's a ceiling on that, there's a side constraint on religious liberty, unless the interest is a compelling one, that is, the interest in burdening you, the objector, is compelling, and the means selected is the least restrictive means available. So in fact, there is, for better or worse, in the U.S. Code, a law that says you have this presumption to be free from substantial burdens of religious freedom by the government, the federal government, and subject to these. So there actually is, the Congress does in fact create a framework within which this balancing question is presented as unwieldy as it may or may not.
Some other questions? Kevin.
My question is for Professor Zucker also. I have a political science PhD student. You mentioned the Sherbert's case, and also with the wartime conscience and objectors. I was just wondering if you would, it seems like in those particular cases, the third parties are harmed in a way that is similar to the way the third parties were harmed. But you say that they would be harmed by this mandate. In the case of war, it seems like, well, first with the Sherbert decision, in the case of the other employees of these companies who only have it seems like that's kind of a real third-party disadvantage compared to the one who have 2 days off. And then with war, there's a lot of wars that I would object to fighting, but the government doesn't give me that privilege. It does privilege people who have a special vocational calling to not ever fight wars, but not people who object to certain wars. So I wonder how you would compare those different third-party harms.
Well, I think you're right. There are spillover effects or third-party effects probably in anything that we do. The minute you let somebody out of doing something, some obligation, that some percentage more of that falls to somebody else who isn't exempted. So I suppose that's correct. It seems to me there's a difference in, how should we say, in scope in these two cases, in the fact if you had exempted institutions, there would be a very direct and certain effect on identifiable other persons. Whereas in the case if you would win conscientious objector status to going into the military, there's no identifiable other person who's going to suffer from that. So I think that makes a difference of some significance. The other fact is, at least as I understand it, and perhaps those here who know better than I about what Catholic doctrines on this are, it seems to me that there's a difference in directness of the conscientious violation, the violation of conscience that's being mandated. If a person is required to go to war and shoot at people, that is a direct violation, in this case, of that person's conscientious conviction. Whereas, as I understand the Catholic position, I maybe need to be corrected on this, the objection is actually to the use of contraception, and nobody is being required to use contraception. All that is being required is that there be some kind of indirect support that others might use to use contraception. Others who may themselves not be Catholic or may not have the same conscientious objections. And that seems to me to be also a significant difference, the indirectness of the violation, if you will, of conscience in this case.
Professor Zucker, can I push you a little bit? I mean, there's an issue of abortifacients. That's a complicated issue. Let's just simplify it and say employers are forced to pay for abortions. Does that change anything you just said?
Well, fortunately, this isn't what the law requires. Personally, I would find that more troubling. I'm not sure how I would argue it out, and I feel grateful that I haven't had to do so.
Please, ma'am, yeah, in the back.
When the government is taking over to, I appreciate Catholic social justice says, yes, we need to seek out to give, people housing, shelter by the nature of our heart. We never said that the government should provide. And I met a young lady from Hillsdale College, and I'm so happy that there's so many in the Constitution. I wish my son had considered Hillsdale. I just feel that, thank goodness, Notre Dame is concentrating on that issue of the, I think we have many fine constitutional attorneys that appreciate God bless your efforts too. But I just take objection to the fact that someone should say that we should ignore conscience, and just go with that's a moral relevance that is just takes my Catholic nature of absolute. We should like to share with others, they don't have to do it. But I just feel that we don't need to be done with this attitude. We have a lot to learn from. We have later from this, and from our constitutional students that study. So I just wanted to comment on that first. And one issue, Father Esper, Joseph Esper, gives a retreat, and he said we are already into the third stage of persecution. We have been stigmatized, stereotyped as Catholics. We have been marginalized, over so tainted if we really believe in, no abortion, no abortifacients, no contraception. You're being vilified. Next is criminalized when the penalties kick in, and then comes our persecution. The prison part of the Lord said, he will die a normal death. Next generation of priests in jail. Next one persecuted. And we're down the slippery slope. Why should President Obama, who should wear blinders as to accommodate him? Father Esper has written the book Defiance, the Antichrist over the centuries, and I just feel in the slippery slope toward being in that situation in he says we're bottom of the third, we're going to talk to criminalize it. Next, I hope we get our government back. You know, we really have to get going with overcoming, you know, its violations of his own law. You know, stuff that I don't know where.
Okay, thank you. It's a little bit hard to hear up here, but something that at the beginning of your question made me think of the issue of Catholic social thought, the call for universal health care. With Mr. McGurn's talk yesterday, well, we've had a sexual revolution, and with it a redefinition of what health is. And I wonder if that's not an issue lurking beneath the surface here. You know, what is it? What is sexual health? And is that something we have to address to actually address these legal questions about contraception? And is there a role for that conversation in our public policy?
Well, one of the comments I was going to make, again, I couldn't hear everything in the terms of the question, but one of the points that was made, and certainly in terms of Catholic social teaching, this conviction that, you know, there's certain needs that all human beings have that need to be met, but there's also nothing that suggests that the government is the principal or only agency to accommodate those needs. And it's important to remember, I think, that in our context and culture, I think as we live in a heavily politicized, the 24-hour media, constant awareness, we tend to assume that the only way to accomplish anything is political, that cultural change is fundamentally affected by political mechanisms. Obviously, politics, law, they all play a big part in that. But I think there's more to it than simply reducing everything to, as soon as this changes politically or even legally, that necessarily the cultural change. It seems to me that the gospel and the Catholic Church is committed fundamentally to, you know, the conversion of culture, not just the conversion of a political group, party, government, and it's existed historically in any number of types of governmental systems, greater or lesser degrees of freedom, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's important not to assume that our necessary go-to move is always to rely simply on politics as the most important or only mechanism in accomplishing kind of social amelioration and change and cultural conversion that's desirable. I think that is important to say.
Okay, maybe time for just one or two more questions, please.
I have a question for you. You mentioned that the assumption of the question is that we're not talking about the legality or illegality of the law itself. But the other part of the assumption and the question is that the business owner in question, the ethical obligations, is Catholic. And one of your primary examples in your argument is that it actually harms the third party to not provide this benefit. And then you've heard the two Catholics on the panel say they have precisely the opposite view, which is it harms women to provide this. So I'm just wondering, what is the relevance of your argument for the Catholic business owner? And is there a way that you can formulate it? Because I appreciated your focus on what actually constitutes conscientious objective status. But is there a way that you can formulate it that it would actually be relevant?
Without which is it?
Is there a way you can formulate your argument in terms of what it constitutes to be a conscientious objector in a way that doesn't ignore the assumption, which is that the business owner is Catholic and believes it harms both the primary party and the third parties to provide this?
Well, I mean, I found that argument interesting. I mean, I think that at least much of the time, those employees who would be offered contraceptive coverage wouldn't consider it harmful. Now, in some sense, I suppose it could be, my colleague here would argue that it is objectively harmful, but not, I mean, that seems to me a very debatable point. And so I don't find the need to use the term harm in my formulation. It denies interests or legal rights that others would have. I mean, so we can leave the issue of harm out of it, as far as the formulation of my position goes.
Okay, maybe one more? Please, Dan Philpott.
I also wanted to pose a question to Michael Zucker, and it has to do with when we talk about religious freedom and the scope for religious freedom. I mean, one of the questions we have to ask is exactly what religion is. What kind of activities and words and practices, constitutes religion. And so, in the beginning of your address, you made, you expressed agreement with the idea of religious freedom and with, making accommodations and room for things that are called religion. You mentioned worship and you mentioned a few other things. But I wonder if it would change the nature of the way we look at the question of directness and so forth by asking, or perhaps calling for an expansion of what it means to live one's religion, namely to incorporate this kind of what one might call witness, or kind of the message effect of one's actions and deeds, such that the business owner is now not just sort of remotely or indirectly cooperating with an action that he or she disagrees with, but it invokes the kind of message or witness that he or she wants to live. So if I'm a business owner and now I'm paying for this, even if we could justify it on the kind of remote material cooperation grounds, it still sort of contradicts the way that people view me and the way that I want to be seen and the kind of message and way that I want to sort of carry myself through the world. And look, I'm not saying that this is going to resolve all the right mind kind of questions about the Amish and the Christian Scientists and so forth. It does seem to kind of expand what we think of as religion to give more scope to the kind of claims the Catholic business owner and so forth. So, what do you think of that?
Well, I just see it as admirable and attractive, but pretty unworkable as a political or legal doctrine. I mean, I do think although I think it is accommodated or incorporated within the notion I try to express of the conscientious decision by the business owner or any agent who has conscientious concerns to live what his conscience thinks or tells him is the right thing to do. That seems to me to be fine, admirable. Perhaps. It depends what his conscience is telling him to do, of course. But it seems to me that we can't just say that society can operate by people living out whatever it is their sense of religion tells them they should be doing. For example, I spent many years living in Minnesota, where there's a very large Hmong population. And the Hmong people like to, and it's part of their way of life, if you will, including religious dimensions, that they have arranged marriages for their daughters at age 7 or younger. And the state of Minnesota, in its wisdom, decided, well, this wasn't really a good policy, and so it forbade it. Now, it seems to me that that's a reasonable thing for the state of Minnesota to have done, but so how would your policy react to that?
Yeah, any thoughts? Sure.
I mean, it doesn't give a kind of answer to how we do the balancing. Any religious freedom always has limits and balancing. You can't do anything in the name of religion. But in trying to make the determination of where that balance is, incorporating the witness dimension of what religion is into the picture, I think would give more weight and widening to the religious freedom claim.
Is there another dimension of this question? I mean, the more the state does, the more likely we're going to conflict with religion, right? I mean, that's just inevitable, right? Even when the state's trying to provide very good things, right? We're diverse people, diverse representatives. The more the state compels individuals to do something, the more likely those individual consciences, religious or otherwise, will be limited, right? I mean, isn't that an obvious lesson that we're seeing here?
Could be. I mean, I'm not I'm a small state guy, so I'd rather see the government do less. I mean, that's, yes.
Look, we intentionally tried to put together a panel of very intelligent people who have different views, and it was a model, I think, of civil discourse. So thank you very much to our panel.